for the onset of the nuclear test program in Australia that we're honouring its ongoing impacts and the still unmet needs for nuclear justice this evening. The World Health Organization, when it considered the impacts of nuclear weapons, unequivocally considered them the greatest immediate threat to health, and that remains the case today. And it's important to remember that the purpose of nuclear testing was to perfect these instruments of planetary destruction. There have been over 2,000 nuclear tests conducted by probably all of the 9 nuclear-armed states. Over 500 of those were in the atmosphere above the ground, including all of the tests that the United Kingdom conducted in Australia and in the Pacific. And it's worth remembering that we're not the only ones, so in this part of the world, that suffered these impacts. Apart from the 3 sites in Australia, nuclear weapons were tested in the Marshall Islands, at Bikini and Enewetak, at Johnston Atoll, off the Chitka Islands near Alaska, at Malden and Kirimati in modern-day Kiribati, in French Polynesia, all by great powers essentially doing dirty business in what they thought was the backyard of people who either didn't matter or mattered less. This is the symbol for ionising radiation. It's pretty obvious that from this is intended to convey it's dangerous and one should keep a significant distance from it. And I think it's worth reminding ourselves just how multifarious are the various forms of harm that radiation can do, and reflect that it's a particularly nasty form of energy in terms of its biological impact, because even an amount of radiation that would be the equivalent of a sip of hot coffee that you might have could be a lethal dose of radiation. It's particularly damaging to the big complex molecules that make us who we are, and it can have effects across generations. Even though the deposition and this sort of thinner lines with the circles, this is for strontium-90, one of the important fallout products from nuclear tests. Once the tests in the atmosphere ceased in the early 80s, those levels of what was actually being deposited constantly came substantially down. But because these materials have, many of them, extremely long half-lives, they persist for long periods of time. So essentially, for the longer lived ones, what was deposited over time is still pretty much all that's out there. These are some pictures of the chromosomes of nuclear test veterans that witnessed tests at Christmas Island 50 years before. And they had more than 3 times the rate of abnormal rearrangements of these packages of vital genetic material than people who hadn't participated in the test. Once you've been exposed to ionising radiation, unfortunately, those effects can't be undone. And while everybody's at some risk, I want to note that it's particularly the young and females, women and girls, that are at greatest risk. This shows sort of cancer risk for a given dose of radiation, depending on when you get it. For girls and women in yellow and for men and boys in blue. And you can see not only that there is a significantly greater risk at young ages, but that there's a significant gender differential. This is a gendered issue. Women and girls are overall about 40% more susceptible to long-term cancer induction for the same dose of radiation as men and boys. IPPNW was involved in a study which a similar one was repeated some years later by the International Council of Scientific Unions, came up with pretty much the same data that, by very conservative estimates, now a couple of decades old, estimated that the total number of people who will die from cancer from atmospheric nuclear weapons tests numbers in the millions. About 2.5 million was our estimate. So even though most of those people don't have names and can't be specifically identified readily, those effects are real nonetheless. In some places where there's been more detailed studies. You can see here in the US an estimate of up to 200,000 extra cancer cases just from the tests that were conducted there at the Nevada test site. And of course, for those who were directly most in harm's way, those who lived in the test sites, there's an ongoing legacy of loss and displacement and disruption that continues to this day. This symbol for the Australian Nuclear Veterans Association of the guinea pig is not entirely inappropriate, and service personnel who participated in the test programs were also put in harm's way in large numbers. I think it's also important to acknowledge that those who've tried to stand in the way of this dangerous and destructive enterprise have sometimes also suffered at the fate of state-sponsored violence. The tests came to Australia in an extraordinary colonial mindset, and for what I think is arguably the worst decision that an Australian government has ever made. The decision-making was also extraordinarily deficient. Menzies is widely reported to have acceded to the request to host the tests without even consulting his cabinet or let alone the parliament, and with the very bland reassurance that there would be no danger whatever from radioactivity to the health of the people or animals in the Commonwealth. The information that made clear that there was great harm was often not collected, and where it was suppressed. There were radioactive clouds that seemed to get lost, their path not being tracked. For the tests at the Montebello Islands, the two of them, the second of those was actually the largest test ever conducted in Australia, and fallout was measured after the first one at quite high levels in Rockhampton and in Brisbane, as the westerlies carried that fallout over the mainland. This is the second Montebello test, the largest one that was conducted here at about 4 times the size of the Hiroshima bomb. And that fallout went right across the top of the continent. During the tests, pretty much all of the country got multiple dustings of radioactive fallout, with the exception of just the bottom corner, southwest corner of Western Australia. And service people were put in harm's way, going back to ground zero within hours of tests often to collect equipment and take samples with little monitoring and no protection. The Maralinga tests and the EMU field tests have left the most bitter legacy of contamination that we still have to deal with. And I think it's also worth reflecting that that fallout went very widely across the continent for different tests, again putting about 16,000 Australian test personnel at significant risk later, even decades later, with all of the difficulties of weak data collection, showed a significant increase in cancer in that group, as every other decent study of people involved in the tests has done. But those who were put most blatantly in harm's way were the Indigenous Australians, and there's no better evidence for that than the experience of the communities around Wallatinna in northern South Australia after the first EMU test, when essentially everybody in the community had symptoms that are really extremely likely, almost couldn't be anything else, symptoms of acute radiation sickness, which signify very high exposures. We didn't know the truth about the tests until the Royal Commission in 1985, and it found that most of the residual contamination in Australia was from about 600, not nuclear explosions, but other tests with weapons and weapons materials that dispersed large amounts of nasty, toxic and radioactive materials over the South Australian desert. Despite a large cleanup that Australia and Britain co-funded that cost $108 million and filled up this huge pit with a whole lot of debris and scraped soil from this area where those minor trials, the worst of them, were conducted, you can see that these are the main plumes here, these lines. This little red area is that area that was actually cleaned up. Most of the plutonium is still out there, exposed to dust, despite government reassurances that many of these sites are safe and clean. So there are ongoing needs of nuclear justice for those who were most put in harm's way that all of the nations involved in nuclear testing programs still need to deal with. And the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is the first international treaty to provide obligations to assist the victims of nuclear use and testing and help clean up. So I think that will be a very important tool for us to make sure that these matters are not only not forgotten and not allowed to be forgotten, but are finally addressed more effectively. As Dave has mentioned, this is an extraordinarily dangerous context that we're in, with the risk of nuclear war being probably at least as great as it's ever been. It's unfinished business to get rid of these weapons that were perfected by the tests conducted here and elsewhere. One of the most urgent issues for Australia is the inheritance of the new government of a plan for Australia to acquire nuclear submarines that would significantly damage nuclear non-proliferation and increase the danger of nuclear war, particularly with China. So it's really time for Australia to move from being part of the nuclear weapons problem to being part of the solution by joining the ban treaty. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Tillman. That's sobering, clear, and couple of those images that really highlights both the rudimentary protections and the absurd promises that dominated this time. Thanks very much for that, and for highlighting the positive obligations of the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which will hopefully not just see this never repeated, but see some justice and remediation for those who have suffered and the country that's been affected. We wanted to share with you now, go from Tillman to share with you a snippet from a documentary. The documentary is called Atomic Confessions. You can view it on YouTube. But with the permission of the Torres family, we wanted to show you one part of this, which is an interview with May Torres, the mother of that family. She's passed away subsequently from cancer. The part of the story that they wanted to share, which wasn't included in the film, was that their mum vividly recalled and conveyed to the family that after the cloud began, following the test, there were strings of ash that were suspended and hanging from trees in Broome in northwestern Australia. And Mrs. Torres' kids and family, they can't join us tonight, but they were very happy to share their mum's story, which they said that she'd taken a long time to tell. It hadn't just folded out. She had considered it and for a long time, and then decided to speak out so that people would know the truth of what happened and the impact of what happened, and could learn and understand and take some action and avoid. So we'll show this excerpt now from Atomic Confessions. Much to the filmmakers of Atomic Confessions and to the Torres family. Well, like, nothing about nuclear tests or nuclear weapons is clean. And as Tillman said, and as was said there, one of the Montebello tests in particular, the Mosaic explosion of 1956, has been described as an exceptionally dirty explosion. And that saw fallout cover large parts of Australia, right across to the eastern seaboard on the other side of the continent. And I think that makes stories like May Torres' all the more important to share and to hear. We're really fortunate tonight to have a direct witness to the Montebello story. Roger Grace was born before World War II in Bedford, and in 1955 was conscripted in British National Service, and he saw service with the Royal Navy. And during that time, Roger witnessed 2 atomic tests at Montebello Islands. After having that experience, he finished his naval service in 1957, went back and was a constable with Bedfordshire Police for the next 30 years. It is a real pleasure to have you join us at this event today, Roger. Welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Yeah. One query on the evidence that Mr. Tillman put forward. G2 was only officially recorded as 60 kilotons in the 80s. And William Penny himself rated before the test that it could be anything between 50 and 80 kilotons. But the UK Prime Minister and your Australian Prime Minister agreed that no test would be more than 2.5 times hurricane, which would have been 62.5 kilotons. That always rankled with me because I don't believe the words. It's been recorded that G2 was anything between 78 and 98 kilotons. Who's telling the truth?
I think that's a question you can ask widely in relation to the nuclear industry there, Roger.
Yeah.
But we would love to hear any other reflections of your time, your experience that you feel comfortable to share.
Yeah. Protective clothing, no protective clothing. We were told that we were 6 miles away on HMS Narvik, the control ship, 6 miles away from G1 and 12 miles away from G2. I've asked for the distances from the MOD and they give them in kilometres. Well, kilometres are never used at sea, it's always nautical miles. And the kilometres that they gave me don't relate to the 6 or 12 nautical miles that we were told we were away from the detonation. Protective clothing, none. Shorts and a hat, that's all we wore. Film badges, we were issued with film badges, but I was boat's crew for a lot of the time and they were held on with a safety pin. So I lost 4 of them. So my radiation dose was never actually recorded. I did ask for that record to be shown to me and I was told that I was given an average dose because of the lost film badges. And the ship's record that they sent with all the names redacted shows that nobody received more than 2.02 millisieverts. And I was given a dosage of 1 millisievert. So one doesn't know how much radiation one had. We were never told anything about radiation, except that the area of Chimney Island where a hurricane was detonated was still radioactive. But there were no signs or anything to tell us not to go there or where we couldn't go. So all in all, a bit of a farce now. Looking back on it, I worry, but at the time, as an 18-year-old, it was great fun. I had to travel halfway around the world to see something that not many people have seen. I hope they're never used.
I think that's a hope we all share very much, Roger. Very much indeed. That is really special to hear you on this occasion. Like, you were on that spot, saw those times. And I just think, it must be a sad thing to watch old comrades go far too early as a result of this and see the difficulties that this has caused to different people's lives. Thanks for joining us tonight. Is there anything else today that you wanted to share with us or say to us?
Oh, I don't think so, not at the moment. If anything else comes up that I've got a question on.
Well, Roger Grace, you have the absolute dispensation to intervene at any time for any reason. And can I just say from all of us here that we're really, really pleased that you were able to join us, and thank you for sharing that story.
Thank you.
Well, for us here in Australia, Montebello was the start of a pretty sorry story of British nuclear testing. After starting at Montebello, like Roger said, an archipelago of over 170 little islands, 130 odd k's off the Pilbara coast in northwest Western Australia, the British nuclear program, the atomic testing program, moved from that saltwater country to the vast desert country of South Australia. Sue Hasseldine is going to be our next speaker, and Sue is a gem. She's a Kokura woman who lives in Ceduna on the west coast of South Australia. She is a nuclear test survivor, outspoken advocate for Aboriginal culture and environmental protection. When Sue was a kid, she was at Coonabar Mission, and when the British carried out nuclear testing at Emu Field and Maralinga in the 1950s and 60s, and has that direct and lived experience of that time and that impact, that cultural impact as well as a contaminating one. She's the co-president of a really important initiative in Australia called ANFA, the Australian Nuclear Free Alliance, which is if you're a combination or a network of Aboriginal-led civil society groups who all share concerns about nuclear developments in Australia. Sue's been, widely acknowledged for her leadership and her work. She's an ICANN ambassador and has spoken right around Australia and right around the world about this, including a keynote presentation at a UN conference in 2017 that saw the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons advanced. Great pleasure to welcome Sue to join us tonight. Thanks, Sue.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for inviting me onto this committee. Look, I've been listening to everything that's being said, and I know what's happened in my family, all the heartache and all the things that have come down through, starting with me and then down to my great-grandchildren, all the cancers and, illnesses that's happened. And I'm just thinking, it started at Montebello and then it finished up there. That's what it finished up with. That's all of Australia, except, like Tillman said, a little bit down Western Australia corner. What chances did us Aboriginal people have when they didn't even respect their own service people or the wider white community? So we had no hope. And my old auntie always said that this illness, this cancer, was never here before those bombs went off. And, we have been suffering down through the ages. I was gutted when I finally realized that I was teaching my kids to probably eat contaminated bush tucker. But what could I do? Everything was already contaminated. All I could do was, like one of my old friends, my special doctor, he's not with us now, but he said, you can't do anything else but keep going. And that's what we've been doing to this day. We are still going. And right at this moment, we have some people that want to do missile testing on our country, guided missile testing. Like, haven't we had enough? Haven't we been poisoned once? Hasn't our country been poisoned? Why do they want to keep destroying everything that we hold near and dear? So if we allow this to keep going, the nuclear submarines, that's going to be a target for, if nuclear war breaks out, that'll be a target. These rocket testing ranges that they're starting to put up on our country, that'll be a target. But do they care? No. How like these big companies and a government that's prepared to put billions of dollars towards what they're doing while our health systems run down? How do we do this? Can somebody, come up with a real good plan that can stop this before it keeps going? Like, we don't want to forget Maralinga and Emu Field and Montebello, because the minute we forget that, we're opening the country up all over again to more contamination. We can't afford that. Our children can't afford it. The next generation can't afford it. The animals can't afford it. Nobody can, and nothing can. I don't know if there's any more I need to say, but we need to stop it now.
Thank you, Artie. And, you know, you say, haven't we had enough? And the answer is yes. And then you say, but we're still going. And we're grateful that you are. We're grateful that Aboriginal people across Australia are still in the vanguard of this resistance. Really tough times. But one thing here, Arnie, is that this is a small gathering tonight, which is representative of a much bigger community that doesn't share any aspiration to see more nuclear threat or more military madness in the world. You're not alone. You're a long way from it. And thanks for sharing those words tonight.
Thank you.
I want to point people out to Alan Owen from LabRats in the UK will be joining us later tonight, but Alan has posted a link to a 70th anniversary video that they've made. So people might want to just grab those details and have a look at that when you've got a little bit more time. Always a hard act to follow Sue Hasseldine, because she's so sharp and to the point of what needs to be done and the injustices that have been done. But the person that's got that hard act tonight is Steve Pearce. Steve, hello and welcome. Steve's an actor. He lives in North Wales. And his dad was RAF, Royal Air Force officer, who was senior role, in fact, in charge in the final years of the atomic test during the minor trials that Tillman referenced, where great damage was done. Steve's dad was in charge of the airstrip at Maralinga at that time. A couple of decades, 19 years after his dad returned to the UK, Steve was born, and born with a range of health conditions and issues that are related and attributable to that exposure and experience. And Steve has very generously joining us, well, tonight for us, this late morning for you. Welcome, Steve.
Hi, thanks for allowing me to speak on this great event. I think commemorating today is really important. As you've said, my father was in charge of the airfield at Maralinga, and he was there during the latter part of the minor trials, which arguably were the most toxic. And I suppose because he was there later on, the ground would have been at its most toxic. He describes, as we know, the safety precautions that were in place were non-existent. He was dressed all the time in boots, shorts, and a shirt. And he also describes there was areas they weren't allowed to go, or there was supposedly contaminated areas that were separated from the non-contaminated areas. And the only separation was a single strand wire fence. Now, I don't need to tell you people who live in Australia that there's a lot of sand out there and a lot of wind. So the wind, he described the wind as blowing the sand in their face, in their food, in their Land Rovers, in their living quarters. And he said we were quite literally bathing in, we were bathed in radioactive sand. He said it was laughable that there was to expect sand to obey a wire fence. So I think there's no doubt whatsoever that Dad was exposed to radiation, and probably quite a lot because of the time he was there. Because he was there when they were doing what I consider was quite reckless experiments. They were trying to recreate what may happen in the event of an accident or an aircraft carrying a nuclear weapon crashed. So they were, he basically said they were literally stacking conventional explosives against warheads and plutonium and blowing them sky high. And there's tales of molten plutonium spraying 200 foot into the air. And of course, the dispersal of that was quite great. And of course, the radiation dispersal from that would be even greater. He also describes that they had access to walk quite freely. No one really stopped them if they wanted to go beyond these little wire fences. And he has seen the glass bowl where there was ground zero from previous exposures. He said you could walk on it. There were bits of glass in the sand. And of course, these must have been incredibly radioactive. And nobody stopped them. There was no information whatsoever that that could be incredibly dangerous. So without doubt, as I say, he would have been highly radioactive. And then he came home after his service, left the RAF, met my mum, and along comes me with visible differences. I was born with short stature, hydrocephalus, a curvature of the spine, and the leg bent the wrong way. That's since been corrected by surgery, but it's worth noting that the form of short stature I've got is unknown. There's 200 forms of known short stature. Mine is unique. And that's a story that is not uncommon amongst the descendants, certainly the ones in the UK. A lot of the health conditions are either unique or incredibly rare. And there's an estimated 155,000 of us. And the range of genetic issues are far and wide, from missing teeth or too many teeth, bones that are misshapen, a lot of cancers, eye conditions, a whole range of them. And I think for me, the sad part is that people like my dad went there with good intention. They were sent there and then they thought they were doing the right thing. And had they known, or had they been told, would they have gone? Would the public have allowed them to go? Would there have been an outcry? So yeah, there's been a lot of cover up. And I think for me personally, apart from my life has been very different to had my dad never been there, I would have probably had a different job, and a whole raft of things would have been different. But the thing that worries me now is the genetic damage that goes on through the generations. Because I always swore I would never, ever pass on whatever was damaged in my genes to the next generation. Said I'm not having children, but I met a lovely lady and we got married and we have had a child. But I kind of feel that I played genetic Russian roulette with his life. He was born very healthy and still is. 17 months later, he's a wonderful little fella. But I worry about the future. I worried all the way through the pregnancy. And this is a kind of, yes, there's a lot of physical effects from the atomic testing, but there's also the psychological effect that gets passed down too, because I live permanently worried about his future. Is he going to develop a cancer when he's in his teens or his 20s or his 30s? Am I responsible for that? Is dad responsible for that? Are we both jointly culpable for that? And then I'm going to have to explain to him when he's older, because of this estimated 500-year genetic damage fallout, is he going to have these conversations with his children? And it just seems, for these weapons that we tested, what's happened? It's not been worth it. We've got the ability to destroy a country, and also we're actually destroying our own people. And it's time to stop. It really is. It's time to get rid of these weapons. And it's time to help, put more help in place. I think your country does a lot more than ours. But it is time that, certainly for the British people, the British descendants, that we get more help, because at the moment there's none. But I'd like to thank you all for listening to me.
Steve, you don't have to thank us. Thank you. That was very brave and very thoughtful, very thinking long, deeply personal. Tell you what, your young lad might have landed with some degree of uncertainty about genetic futures and this and that, but has landed in total certainty of the love that kid's landed in. Lucky kid, and good on you. And I wish you all lots of joy. And thanks for sharing that, because
Thank you.
That was a very powerful piece.
Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Steve. And people are saying in the chat, thanks to you for sharing that story. We're going to hear now from Alan Owen. And Alan's dad, James Owen, was present at Operation Dominic on Christmas Island in 1962. He witnessed 24 atomic detonations in 58 days. And Alan has been campaigning for justice for nuclear communities around the world, veterans and others affected by nuclear impacts, and has dedicated a lot of work and a lot of effort to ensuring that the world does not forget nuclear testing programs, and has formed or set up the Lab Rats Academy to educate this and future generations on this. Alan's family have been significantly adversely impacted by health conditions and great distress as a result of nuclear exposures. And he's one that's put a lot of time and a lot of effort into doing what Steve just said. Let's draw the line under this and stop this now. Great pleasure to have you join us today, Alan.
Thank you very much, Dave. It's a pleasure to be with so many great people who have fought a lot longer than I have. But we've set up Lab Rats in the UK, but it's not just a UK story. This is a global story. Speaking to a filmmaker that we work closely with, Brian Cowden, he states that all effects are global, and that's a statement that I can say definitely for the atomic testing programs around the world. It is global effects. Listening to the indigenous people, the people that were displaced, what Tillman said, it's just mind-blowing that this happened. But more importantly for us, especially in UK and in other countries, is that the governments and successive governments have done so much to airbrush you and the people, the servicemen and the people that were affected by this. You've been airbrushed from history. It's not taught in our UK schools at all. If I was to stand on a street and do a poll of people walking past, I could guarantee that 99% of them would not even know that the UK tested nuclear weapons, because it's not been taught for generations. And our big emphasis at Lab Rats is our ERA program, which is the education, recognition and awareness. It's to make sure that you're never forgotten. And we're not just talking about servicemen. We have other associations that deal with servicemen. We're talking about everybody that's been affected. There are so many people. There are the scientists, there are the indigenous people, there are the servicemen. Everybody has been affected by this, and we need to make sure that nobody forgets about it and the children get educated. So you mentioned our academy. We do have an online academy where all the tests are listed, and we are a proud ICANN partner and work very closely with people like Alicia on ICANN, because the message needs to get out there that we don't want these weapons ever tested again, let alone used again. They need to be destroyed and they need to be wiped from the face of this planet. We are working really hard with a campaign in the UK called the Look Me in the Eye campaign, which challenged high-profile politicians in the UK to look us in the eye. And Steve and I went and met with another veteran. We met Sir Keir Starmer, who was leader of the opposition in the UK in 2021. And he looked us in the eye and said, yep, it's an injustice and it needs to be sorted out. And he has continued to support us. On the 8th of June, we met Boris Johnson, who was then the UK Prime Minister, who looked John Morris in the eye, who was an Operation Grapple veteran. And John said to him, it's your chance now, Prime Minister, to recognise us, do something about this, or you can tell me to sod off. Excuse my language there, but excuse me, to sod off. And that's what he told the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister did keep to his word. But unfortunately, he was ousted out by his Conservative Party government, and we have a new Prime Minister. But I can announce to you today at this event that we've been working with the Office for Veterans Affairs very closely as part of the Look Me in the Eye campaign. And they've today announced that there is a £250,000 oral history project, which is about to be released. And our argument with the OVA and discussions with the OVA has been that this £250,000 oral history project must include everybody that's been affected. It can't just be servicemen. It has to be civilians. It has to be scientists. And we welcome this and another £200,000 to do education in the UK. And hopefully we will be circulating around in the UK at air shows and other events and in schools, telling the stories of the testing programs across the world and how it's affected everybody. It is a global story that needs to be told, that needs to be never forgotten. My father died in 1994, age 52. My brother died in 1996, age 31. My sister's born blind in her left eye. And the doctors have no idea why, apart from my father's connection to the tests. I was lucky until this year I'd not been affected by it. But unfortunately, in April this year, I suffered a sudden cardiac arrest. And I was lucky that I had people around me that would give me CPR and give me a defib and bring me back so that I can carry on with this justice sorting for the nuclear veterans and the atomic test survivors. We hear some horrific stories from so many people across all of the testing programs, not just individually. And we can't allow these people to be airbrushed from history. We have to make sure and work together to make sure they're not, that the whole world is educated of the dangers of this nuclear weapon. The Montebello Islands is somewhere I would love to go and see. But as was stated before by somebody there, that there's a sign on the Montebello Islands that tells you, you can't stay here for longer than an hour. That's still in place now. Yeah, we're talking an awful long time. When you talk to Roger, spoke to Roger lots of times, the Mosaic testing program. If you ask even people who know about the nuclear testing programs in the UK to list the tests, they will miss out the Mosaic test. They will talk about Hurricane, they will talk about Grapple, they'll talk about Dominic. But Mosaic is one that always gets missed. And yet it was one of the most deadliest ones with the Vixen trials and the minor trials. And as Roger says, we still don't even know how powerful that weapon was. How powerful was that detonation? How much fallout from that weapon test? And these are questions that need to be asked. The Ministry of Defence in the UK has over 200,000 documents relating to the testing programs from the UK that they are not releasing. They need to be released, and these people need to be recognised. We're working on medallic recognition in the UK for the people that took part in the tests, and we're hoping that we will get a decision very shortly. The two committees have met, and we hope to get a decision. We hope for it to be today, but unfortunately events with the Queen's death and other things have meant that there's been delayed. But we hope we will get this recognition that they deserve, and we can end this 70 years. It's time to end the storm. It's time to end the 70 years of a hurricane, and we need to do it now. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Alan. And that's a really important message, that sense of that not to be airbrushed from history, that sense you can't go from an airburst to airbrushed. And I think that work to keep that front of mind is very powerful and very important. And I just think any politician, if there was you and Steve in the room saying, look me in the eye, I think they would either be running out the door or looking in the eye very humbly. Good on you for your efforts. When Arnie Sue spoke, she spoke about how the country is still being impacted, not just by the effects of former testing, but by a new generation of threat and impost. In the case of her country, which is on the eastern side of Maralinga affected lands, that is with proposed or the actual development of a rocket range, which has both commercial and we're increasingly concerned about military applications. We want to show a piece now, an excerpt from, or a piece from a film, because on the western side of that Maralinga affected lands is the Upli Upli community and the Spinifex community, and they're people that were moved off country to facilitate Maralinga testing going ahead. They're now facing the threat of uranium mining on their country. WA's first commercial uranium mine is located on their patch. So we wanted to basically, in that same sense that we've been saying tonight about resistance, remembering and renewal and resistance, to just give a feature and a shout out to their struggle and the campaign they're having there to keep their country and community, which has been heavily impacted by former nuclear testing, now not to be further impacted by future uranium mining.
Hello, everyone. Maria from the Upli Nurja clan. With us, our main concerns is the Vimy mine, the Mulga Rocket mine, is on the top of the Queen Victoria Springs Nature Reserve, which is in our area of our home. It's been in our family for years. From the time we've been here, our family have lived there all their lives. They've lived off the earth, they've lived off the land. They've been born there, they've died there. Since we've got more vehicle access and things like that, we've been able to go out there and sleep and practice our cultures and everything like that. Sadly, my father's people were from Maralinga, and the Maralinga bombing happened, so we know exactly what the nuclear and the waste stuff can do to our land and our country. I wasn't even born when Maralinga happened, and I've been lucky enough to go back over there over 20 years ago. The cleanup is absolutely shocking. It takes a long time. So with this uranium mining that's happening up the top of our country, it's horrific. We don't want it, and we've seen mine sites being built, runways being built. This is our country, our land, and we have family that still live out in the bush, that still live not too far from there, that still go out and access these areas. The main thing is, like a lot of us are now grandparents. I never had the opportunity to grow up in my dad's country of Maryland, or we don't even have the opportunity to go there now because of the site that's been ruined. We don't want that for our own children. We don't want that for our next generations to happen. It's all good and well to say that uranium mining is going to bring a lot of money into the country, but it's going to be devastating. There's long-term effects. The water's going to go missing. The land's going to be cleared. The animals are going to go. Our people won't be able to go out there and practice their law or their cultures anymore. We won't be able to teach our children anything out there. It's going to be all lost again. Even in the long run, when they say, a couple of generations, they're going to take our water. They're going to take everything. It's going to ruin everything. And we need to keep it safe for our children. The thing that's happening over in Ukraine is just another example of what could happen to us. We don't think it's going to happen, but it can happen. And we just don't want to be accountable to take, stuff from our country to make it worse for other countries. We all want to live in peace. We all want to live in harmony.
Indeed we do. Thanks, Mia, and thanks to Upli Upli Mob for that. And that sort of brings us to the end of speakers and presentations, but not to the end of this event. We've got a bit of time to have some questions and maybe another closing reflection from our speakers before we go. But I just want to note too, picking up on Alan's work about the importance of remembering, the importance of not letting this to be, and people's experience and lives to be airbrushed from history. There was a comment from Lynn in the chat, and she uses the phrase, which is an amnesia in the Australian media about this issue. And I think that's really captures, and it's like a conscious not seeing in many ways about these sort of questions. And part of the thing that we need to do is what we're doing, which is ensure that this story is told in large forums, in modest forums, but just not forgotten. And that's a really important thing. So I'd like to thank everybody for being part of this tonight. I'd particularly like to thank the speakers and the presenters. There's resources that are being added into the chat from different people. There's Alan's film resource, David Noonan, a long-standing anti-nuclear activist here in Australia, has added a briefing paper, and there's all sorts of things. So do check out the chat. But we've got the opportunity now for any questions or any sort of further questions from people or observations from speakers. I'm not sure if any questions. Sorry, Roger.
Yeah, I'll just like to elaborate on Alan's education program. Before the COVID lockdown in the UK, I tried to get round to as many organisations as I could and give an illustrated talk about my experiences from photographs that were available for me to buy from the ship during Mosaic. And what amazed me was that virtually nobody knew about the testing. They all knew that we'd got atomic weapons, but nobody knew what happened for the testing of them. And that really surprised me. I'm trying to get back onto the circuit now, but it's a bit difficult.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. And it must also be, you know, you must wonder sometimes what that was all for, if everyone's forgotten when you turn up and people don't even know that it was there. That's a difficult thing indeed. Are you in touch? Can I ask you, Roger? Are you in touch with other colleagues and you know, former colleagues and service personnel friends that on the
I've only communicated with one person who was on the ship that I was on from Mosaic, and he really didn't want to talk to me very long. So I've only spoken to him once. I've never come across anybody else who was on HMS Narvik for the Montebello tests. Never. Maralinga, yes. Christmas Island, everybody knows about Christmas Island. But very few know about the Montebellos and Mosaic in particular. I think it was all covered up, Mosaic, as much as possible by the government.
I agree there, Dave, with Roger. The Mosaic test is one which, if you try and investigate it in the UK even, we have thousands and thousands of documents now from the MOD. But I've spoken to Roger lots of times about this, and out of the probably 40,000 documents that I have, probably only, what, Roger, 50, 60 relate to the Mosaic tests?
Very few.
There are very few in terms of what exactly happened. You know, we have detailed information from the Grapple series, but very little detail about Mosaic and the Montebello Islands at all. And yeah, I know it's 1952, 70 years ago, but there is very, very limited information that we have relating especially to Mosaic, especially G2.
And it's all been withdrawn from the National Archives.
Thanks for that. I noticed in the chat, and I don't want to put you on the spot, Maxine Goodwin, but it's to invite you, if you wanted to. I noticed in the chat you shared that you were here in memory of your dad, who was who was exposed to radiation in Operation Hurricane, passed away age 49. Can you just share what that means for you?
Well, I say hi to Alan. I've met Alan in the UK. I've had the privilege of going over there and speaking to veterans in the UK. Haven't really met any veterans in Australia, unfortunately. Oh, only one, sorry. So my dad was 20 when he went to Onslow as a radar technician and was there, I think they went in August. He was a transport division. It's been a while since I've actually looked at his documents, so it's probably a little bit inaccurate. So on the 4th of October, the day after the test, he was in a Dakota aircraft. They were patrolling the coast, and as they were coming back, they were exposed to radiation. So he never spoke about it at all until he became unwell when I was probably about 7 or 8 years old. So he was probably in his early 40s at the time. So he had a rare lymphoma, and probably not long before he passed away, my mother and him were made aware of the Australian Nuclear Veterans Association. So he passed away in August 1981, and my mum joined the Australian Nuclear Veterans Association. She actually did apply for compensation after he passed away, and that was dismissed. The response from the Australian government was that it was possible but not probable that he was exposed to radiation. There was an appeal in 1984, and my mother's passed away in the last few years too. So I'm sort of just relying now on what I'd been told as a teen, and for some reason that appeal was dismissed, and she could never remember why. In the last 5 or 6 years, I've got all those documents from the Australian Archives, and I've been doing my own research. I've also spoken to Dr. Liz Tynan and read her most recent book about the emu tests. My dad was at Woomera straight after Operation Hurricane. He was there for 3 years, and just with conversations with Liz Tynan, I'm pretty convinced that he would have been involved in the total tests indirectly, working out of Woomera. So that's part of his history I need to explore more. But looking at all the documents that I have and piecing everything together, I have absolutely no doubt at all that his exposure to radiation and his time at Woomera, servicing aircraft that was going backwards and forwards from Woomera, and the totem test, that he would have been definitely exposed to radiation on more than one occasion. But he never spoke about it until he got sick, and the only thing he ever said was that he was in a plane that was exposed to radiation. So all the other information that we have, I've sort of pieced together over the last probably 15 years, just going through the archives and meeting other veterans and talking to them and their experience, meeting descendants and talking to them. Yeah, I'm really glad that these forums are still available to tune into and just continue to tell the story, because it is an extremely important one. So thank you. Thanks for giving me a chance to speak.
Hello, my name's Andy Alcock. I'm from South Australia, and I'm a retiree now, but I still consider myself a environmental health and human rights activist. Many years ago, I did a review of a book, No Conceivable Injury, which was written by Robert Millikan and was about the tests at Maralinga. For the South Australian Teachers Journal, it was decided it should be a full-page article, and I did quite a bit of work doing extra research, and I spoke to a health professional at Sydney University who told me that he was really worried about the kids at Emu Creek on the Maralinga lands, because as part of their education at their Aboriginal school, they spent a lot of time sitting on the ground. And he said he was very worried about the high numbers of tiny pinheads of plutonium that they could be sitting on, or if they disturbed the dust, they could be breathing in. So that's another thought. But there's a very important film that was mostly made in South Australia. It's called Backs to the Blast. And the title refers to the order that service people were given when the devices were detonated, they turned their backs to the blast. And many reported they put their hands over their faces when they did that, and they saw X-ray photographs of the bones in their fingers. So it was a high level of radiation that they faced. In Backs to the Blast, they interviewed a pilot, and he described how they had to spend several hours literally flying through radioactive clouds, taking air samples. And he said when they got off the plane, the British scientists who were waiting for them were in spacesuits, lead-lined aprons and gloves, special glasses, the whole bit. And they had been flying around with just their shorts on because it was so hot. And the film also looks at and interviews some of the Aboriginal people who were also very badly affected by it. So I thought I'd just share those thoughts with you. But this has been a great session. Thank you very much to the organisers for putting it on. And I think it also means for all Australians, but particularly South Australians, we do not want AUKUS, which is the production of the nuclear submarines in Port Adelaide. Thank you.
Fair play to you, Andy. Thank you. Thank you. And what you said then about was just echoed what Roger said earlier about him in shorts and t-shirt versus full protective gear. Roger, are you waving hello to Andy or something to add?
I can just elaborate on Andy seeing the bones in your hands from G2, who had their back to the destination. We were told to close our eyes, put our hands over our eyes. The flash was such that you could actually see like an X-ray, and it obliterated the sun. It's impossible to describe the brightness of it. The heat on the back of our neck was if somebody was holding a 2-bar electric fire close to your neck. It was that hot, and the blast took the clothes out as if you were standing in a gale. And that was 12 miles away. After about 8 seconds, we were allowed to turn around and look at the mushroom cloud. You didn't look straight ahead. You looked up like that because the cloud was so high in the sky that that was after 8 seconds. The cloud was so high, you had to look up to it. And that's all I can tell you about witnessing an atomic explosion. Any photograph that you see, the colours cannot be described. There's reds and whites and black and grey in the cloud. It's impossible to see it in a photograph. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you. Andy.
Can I just quickly mention that the film refers to the British scientist who was the radiation health physicist for the tests at Maralinga, and his name was Sir Ernest Titterton. Titterton went on to become a professor of nuclear physics at the Australian National University and was a great proponent of nuclear energy in this country. But I have to say, he did a lot of lying about what safeguards were taken for the Maralinga test. He's no longer with us, of course, but I think it's just important to know that he was a key figure in trying to hide the true story from coming out.
And Andy, picking up on that, one of the best days' work that Ernest Titterton ever did was to make one of his bald assurances that there could be no harm whatsoever and no one was injured whatsoever on ABC radio in Alice Springs, and was heard at the time by Yami Lester, who
was
whose
blinded.
story, who was blinded by the fallout, and whose photo and story was captured a little bit in Tillman's presentation. And Yami Lester said, "Oh, that's absolutely outrageous," and then that fired him up to focus on and work and get the advocacy that was key in getting the McClellan Royal Commission established, the Royal Commission into the effects of British atomic testing in Australia. So absolutely the case. And your comment, Roger, about the was brighter than the sun, it just put me in mind of Oppenheimer. You know, Robert Oppenheimer from the Manhattan Project said, if the radiance of 1,000 suns were to burst at once into the sky, that would be like the splendor of this mighty one. And Robert Jung had written a book, Brighter Than 1,000 Suns, talking about nuclear weapons and explosions. So yeah, it's certainly a power that's beyond our ken. The wisest one in the chat, in my view, at the moment is going on is Julianne's dad, who delivered material for the construction of the bomb tower at Montebello, and then was asked did he want to stay to watch the explosion, and said no at high speed as he was getting the hell out of there. So look, I think these stories tonight, like just teasing out, as you have set the pace, the speakers have set the pace, and then that's opened up, and like comments like Julianne, the sharing from Maxine, there's you know, so many painful and unfinished stories. And I know from Arnie Sue and Karina Lester and others, there's so many stories across Aboriginal Australia about this as well. And it's such an important thing and such a privilege actually to sit here and watch that unfold, and for people to feel comfortable enough to share that. So thanks for everyone who has, and we absolutely need to ensure that there is justice for those who are still with us, and that there's hope and a future and recognition for the next generation from this. I've lost track a little bit of chat, but I'll just check to see if there's any questions from anybody, apart from the observation that, yeah, like backs to the blasters, like duck and cover. And on that note, there's duck and cover. There's even a worse. The New York City Emergency Department recently put out a formal public health and safety warning about what to do in the event of a nuclear attack on New York. Like, this isn't 1950s. This was 2 months ago. This was issued. And it finishes up with a very glib woman saying, "You've got this." The advice is basically get in a bunker if you can, move to the centre of your house if you can't, and wait till you're told to go outside. But you've got this. We haven't got this. The Red Cross, one of the ICANN partners, says that you can't respond to, you must prevent. And listening tonight to Roger, to Steve, to others, to Alan, the story is coming out here again and again. And I hear it a lot because I'm fortunate to hear Tillman talk about the medical imperative of stopping. But you know, it's very clear. And that sense that you've raised, Andy, about the, you know, no more surprises, no more AUKUS and submarines, nuclear powered or otherwise, surfacing without consent. That just reeks of Robert Menzies handing over vast slabs of country for nuclear testing. And so there's a real urgency in our work and a real importance. I noted that Sue said, and I noted a few other people said, you know, how can we do, what can we do, how can we stop? And sometimes there's an edge of being so weary and it's just unrelenting. Yet the pivotal thing is that if you look at what would happen if ourselves and the people in our circles and the people that care about this didn't, this would be airbrushed from history. There would be mines everywhere. There would be weapons testing zones everywhere. There would be radioactive waste dumps everywhere. There would be unfettered militarism as opposed to contested militarism. And so I think it is absolutely imperative that on times like this that we take a moment, look after ourselves, and know that we need to just keep telling that story and, you know, absolutely bearing witness. And as Grant's just said, better active than radioactive. I reckon that might just open for, see if there's any final questions. And then I'd like to just, with the consent of the crew, the presenters, just ask for a final reflection. Steve.
I just wanted to ask, it's in relation to a study that was done in the UK, which found that 20% of descendants, well, there's a 20% birth defect rate in descendants against a 2% in the general population. I just wondered whether, if anyone knows in Australia, whether there's a similar pattern or a similar amount amongst either the service personnel from Australia, the civilians, or the indigenous populations.
Tillman, please.
I don't think it's been studied or specifically evaluated.
We're not up there. Dave, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Artie.
To that young fella's question there, what about the Woomera Kids Cemetery? You know, and that was just the white children. That was nothing done on the Aboriginal kids that died too. But you just got to look at that one cemetery to know that there was a lot of things going on there with the babies that shouldn't have been. So you know, it's probably not a real study, but there's evidence of buried, all the non-Aboriginal children that are buried. No evidence of Aboriginal children though. But we would have lost just as many, if not more. Is that what he was asking?
It is part of what Steve was asking, and Tillman's point of like detailed study, like there is a vast absence here, Steve.
Yep.
There's been an issue, like what Arnie Sue just referred to, is that there's a section of the cemetery in Woomera. I think Maxine, was it your dad that was posted to Woomera for 3 years or so? But like, there's a section of that cemetery that has a disproportionately high and very disturbing infant section, like, you know, from 0 to 3. There's multiple graves of little kids, little creatures, and it's far beyond what would be a statistical norm. So there's quite a lot of thinking and talk going into what does that mean, and trying to tease out more of that. There is one of the ICANN board members and a co-founder, Dimity Hawkins, is currently involved in discussion with ARPANSA, our federal nuclear regulator here, the Australian Radiation Protection and Nuclear Safety Agency, around an extensive bone and teeth scanning program that they had for strontium pickup in the 50s and 60s in this country. So there's people that are trying to pull together pieces of this, but, you know, there's still very big gaps in our understanding. Yeah. I might ask just if people who were, and Maxine's said Frank Walker's book on Maralinga refers to our references, the Woomera story. But yeah, look, Aboriginal Australia, there are very many powerful stories about the impact of nuclear testing. I'd like to, as we come close to the end of this session, and I'd just like to say it's been a very powerful session for me. This has just been great to see and to hear this. Not great joyous, but great important and great ground truth true. I'd like to ask the speakers to maybe just make a, if you want to, only if you want to, a closing reflection or observation. Maybe start with you, Till, like we did.
Sure. Thanks, Dave, and thanks everybody for sharing stories. You know, many of which are deeply personal and perhaps painful, and it takes courage to relive those and share them. thank you for doing that. It relates to what I wanted to say, which was really that, you know, the only bright spot in the nuclear landscape really at the moment is the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And there's a couple of things that were not only really critical in getting that first ever prohibition of nuclear weapons in international law, but in changing the way that nuclear business is done, with by far the most inclusive and evidence-based and respectful process that exists in the nuclear weapons field. You know, I was in the room during the lead up to those negotiations at the United Nations General Assembly and at the negotiating conference when Auntie Sue and Karina Lester and Setsuko Thurlow and other hibakusha from Japan provided testimony, you know, also deeply courageous and personal. You could hear a pin drop when they spoke, and there, alongside the crucial sort of evidence base about what nuclear weapons do and the very real dangers of their use, that compelling personal testimony, those stories of people who know best what the terrible transgenerational injustice of being under a mushroom cloud better than anybody else, that cut through like nothing else. The president of that negotiating conference, Elaine White Gomez, the wonderful Costa Rican ambassador, was asked shortly after the treaty was concluded, you know, what do you think made it possible to achieve an extraordinary international treaty in less than a month of negotiating over 6 months? Really extraordinary. And she said, you know, the real evidence about the dangers of nuclear war and the catastrophic consequences. But then she said, looking in the eyes of the survivors every day in that room and knowing that we couldn't fail. So these personal stories may be difficult to tell, but it's really important that they are told loud and clear and heard and heeded. And they are a very powerful tool in connecting to heads and hearts and helping to bring about the end of nuclear weapons. And the ongoing work of the states parties to the treaty, recently developed at their first meeting in Vienna, makes clear that this inclusive process of respect and listening and wanting survivors in the room will continue. So thank you all. It's one of the things I'm most proud about ICANN for, is making sure for us that since the first Vienna conference that Auntie Sue spoke at in 2014, she or Karina were given an opportunity to be at every one of those meetings that led to the treaty negotiations. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Tillman. Roger, any thoughts?
Yeah, very, very interesting session. I'd just like to leave on a little bit of a lighter note. As you said, I was a police constable for 30 years. In the first 5 years, in the late 50s, early 60s, we had to have civil defence lectures once a year, 2 days of talking about what the police would do if an atomic attack was brought to the UK. And after 5 years, the same lecturer came and said the concentric circles, full damage, light damage, we would go in and do this, meaning with the police. And I said, well, have you ever seen any of these atom bombs go off? Oh, no, he said, I've got all the information and all the pictures of what would happen. I said, well, I've seen 2 of the bloody things, and to be honest, you won't see my backside for dust. But obviously I would have done my job, but that was how it came over to me at the time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roger, and thanks for joining us today, very much so. Arnie, Sue, any observations from you? And first up, thanks very much. Easy topic to talk about, but any parting observations from you?
Yeah, I'm really pleased to hear everybody. You know, I'm really proud of everybody that's spoken tonight and all. But I've just got one plea. Please, please do everything in our power to protect our future generations and our animals and the rest of the world. That's what I really want to get out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie, very much so. Steve, you're working to protect at least one part of the future generation. Any closing comments or observations from yourself?
Yeah, I think joining this today has been brilliant because I got to hear firsthand from more people, and I think that's the way forward. It's about getting your story out there. It's about getting everyone's story out there, and it kind of makes me more determined than ever to get what we want, over the line. Because I think it's not a hard ask once people start listening to you. It's not a difficult story to listen to, in the fact that Alan and I were at the Labour Party conference this week, and we had a little event where we talked to people. And once you can get people in the room and you start to tell your story, as I mentioned before, you can't hear a pin drop. People are engaged. People come up to you afterwards and say, I knew nothing about this. And I think that's the beauty of what we have here today, is we have people that are willing to talk and willing to keep this alive in the consciousness of people. And I think that's the way forward at the moment. I really do believe that quite strongly. But yeah, thanks for today.
Thank you, Steve. First, it's been a great pleasure and honour. Before I go to you, Alan, to close us off, I want to just give a big shout out to Mia Pepper from Conservation Council of Western Australia. Mia has driven this. She's made it happen, and she's done it with, there's two graces. There's a Roger Grace and there's the grace of Mia Pepper on this conversation today. She's done it with grace and style. Really, really well done. She's also still going. She's put recently links to ICANN Cities Appeal, to the Lab Rats film link, and to WA's Nuclear Free Charter in the chat. So have a look, have a grab, capture it for looking at later. And Alan, closing thoughts from yourself.
My closing thoughts really is firstly to thank everybody for getting together for this event, because it's so important to mark this 70th anniversary. But we finish with a statement from sort of Lab Rats that says that what these people did knew it was wrong. They knew it was wrong, but they continued on anyway for many years to continue this testing. And it was completed at all costs, both to the people involved, the land, the ecosystems, the animals, and lots of innocent bystanders. Now is the time for the TPNW. It must be implemented. And we must continue to work with ICANN and everybody else that's campaigning, and that we will stand with anyone who's affected by the testing program and help anybody in the world that's been affected. Thank you.
Alan, that's just a super way to finish what's been a very powerful and very profound and very timely session tonight. So I think we're at an end of this part of our struggles and our efforts, and we're at the start of the next chapter of building a safer world into the future. Thanks so much, Mia. Thanks so much, everyone. To our speakers tonight, you've all been generous and brave and very insightful. I know, I look at the faces on this list, and I know a lot of people here, go to a lot of meetings or a lot of Zooms, but so do I. But this one has been a particularly special event. Thank you for making it so, and thanks for giving us all a grounding and a reminder of the importance of the work we do, and let's collectively take courage to go on and continue to do it to the best of our abilities. Thanks, everybody. Take care. Go well.